He pressed the sandwich to trembling fingertips while the forest held its breath, and two pairs of eyes, amber and feral, human behind the predatory, measured him like a debt collector counting coins. One of the sisters lunged with a sound that was half growl, half sob. Marco flinched, waiting for the teeth and the shredding, the end that small, pathetic men like him were supposed to meet for trespassing. Instead, the sister's massive wet nose nudged his palm, devoured the bread with startling gentleness, and a wet, grieving sound escaped her throat that made Marco want to crawl into the soil and hide forever. He had never seen anything so dangerous wear a face that begged. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. He should have run. The moonlight had that traitor silver, painting the clearing a little too kindly for a man who made his living in shadow. Marco Vellini had been raised to read threats the way others read clock hands, the tilt of a chin, the color of a cuff, the looseness of a gun hand. But faces like those, cautious, animal, horribly human, were a different language. He was 28, slight, the kind of fixer nobody remembered until they needed papers misplaced or a ledger gone off book. He had known fear as a tool. Tonight it felt like a confession. "Easy," he whispered, before remembering they wouldn't hear the tone, only the sound. One sister, skinny catastrophe of muscle and scars, snuffled at the hem of his jacket where the sandwich had fallen crumbs. Her jaws were vast, but when she looked up, there was a flicker he could name. Alicia. He'd heard the name in bar whispers, a story that began in violence and ended with a curse. The other, quieter, smaller in build, but with a war-scarred ear and eyes that had watched too much, watched him with a patience that was more dangerous than the lunge had been. Bianca, he thought. He had read their legends in newspaper margins and whispered police briefs. Enforcers turned exile. Women who had once upheld a code between families with an iron fist, and now, rumor said, wolves. Marco fed them because he had nothing left to lose. There was a debt unpaid in the way the street remembered his mother, a humiliation from a childhood when the Vellini patriarch had bought their silence and left a thin-wristed boy with nothing but a debt to the family name. He had been taught to atone by hands and errands. Survival meant making yourself useful. Tonight, he was useful to hunger. And in the raw, gory moonlight, when a life of things unspoken felt unbearable, he wanted, silly, human, to be seen, not as a shadow, but a small, surviving man who could offer something. That was his sin and his salvation. The sisters accepted him with the thrift of animals. Gratitude counted in days. Favors were currency. They did not speak of the days when they walked in human skin and signed off contracts with blood-stained pens. Their feral mouths told histories at the edge of a cliff, snatches of laughter, curses, the names of children who had been collateral. But when Alessia tucked her enormous head into his lap and Bianca brushed close enough that their fur left dirt on his jacket, Marco felt a fragile tether knot in his chest. It was not pity, it was recognition. Two monsters who had been once forced into a ledgered existence, two women who had been made into weapons and then discarded. Across the river, the lights of the city glittered like a ledger too. Don Luciani's tower stood like a thumb over every ledger in the underworld. His smile in club rooms, his name on the lips of crooked officers, the gold cufflinks of men who still believed in old loyalties because he told them it was profitable. Marco had seen the Don at parties, standing with his wife, a man who could charm a judge and deliver a sentence through a backroom handshake. Luciani wanted myths folded into his balance sheets. He had wanted Lycan since the stories began to blur the line between beast and weapon. To Luciani, power was a product. Buy the right loyalty, weaponize it, and the streets would fall into the neat, profitable divisions he had always preferred. Marco's encounter should have been anonymous, another night swallowed in the city's teeth. But streets are made of whispers and bar stools, and the rumor of two Lycan sisters in a clearing moved faster than grease. By morning, a graffiti tag read like a dare: "Velini feeds wolves." Marco woke with a shadow of the night's warmth on his coat and a new frost in his belly. People began to look at him differently. Men who joked with him in corridors now assessed him as a quantity to be bought. He had grown used to being small within his family's machine, but being valuable in a market you cannot understand sharpened his fear into a different thing: decision. He had to choose: tell the bosses and spare himself a beating by proving usefulness, or hold the secret and hope to keep the sisters hidden. You learned fast in the Velini family that keeping secrets from your own could mean a shorter life. Likewise, turning in a living weapon to Luciani could raise your bones into bedrock. But Marco's other debt tugged. Years ago, when his sister had been taken by a rival crew and no one claimed their boy, a woman with hands like knives, an enforcer turned rumor, had left a quarter in his palm and told him to run. Something in his chest pulled when he remembered that hand. He fed the sisters because parts of his past required repayment and because the world had taught him cheap acts of tenderness could make you dangerous in ways money could not. Alessia and Bianca did not understand the ledger of men. They knew loyalty as hunger knows bread. You give and receive, and you remember who fed you on cold nights. They watched him with an intensity that was personal. When he left, they followed him like a shadow that could eat him if he misstepped. In the alleyways between the Velini warehouse and the Riverwalk, Marco could feel the press of their sentience, like someone breathing down his collar. He pretended not to notice, but at night he slept with one ear open, dreaming of teeth. Word spread in the kind of crooked geometry that the city loved. And a strange detective, Raffaele Conte, who kept a ledger of favors and used it like a scalpel, smelled a story he could chop into profit. He had his own reasons to hate the Lycans. His sister had been a casualty of a gang brawl long ago, and the Lycan legends had been used in the courtrooms to intimidate witnesses. Conte saw an opportunity to raise his profile and climb into Luciani's light. He visited the Velini warehouse under the pretense of casual interest in Marco's affairs. He did not believe in monsters, he believed in leverage. That night he entered the room where Marco cleaned guns and kept ledgers, and his smile was thin as a blade. "You see what happens when you show mercy, boy?" Conte asked, laying a photograph on the chipped table, two wolfish silhouettes against the clearing's moon. Marco watched his hands close into fists. The detective's fingers were clean, his record stained. Don Luciani hears things. He'll be pleased to know you've been playing caretaker for relics the city wants dead. Imagine what he'd do for a man who brings him such trophies. Marco had always read faces for small lies. Conte's face told him two truths. 1. Luciani would buy what he couldn't breed. 2. He valued loyalty over life. Marco felt the net tighten like a noose inching closed. He could surrender the sister's location. He could step upward in the family's ranks and maybe break the debt that had gnawed at his family for years. Or he could refuse and become a problem the Don would resolve with guns and a lesson. When he tried to speak, Conte leaned in, close enough that the light picked out the faintest scar along the detective's jaw. "Think of yourself, Marco. You give me a name, a place, and the Don will make you useful. He'll make you untouchable, or useful enough. People like you don't get chances twice." The implication was cannier than a threat. It was a promise in exchange for what the Don wanted: control. Marco left Conte's office with the photograph burning a hole in his coat pocket and the taste of iron on his tongue. He walked the river path because the water had always been a place that made decisions clearer. Its reflections were honest in a way people never were. The city hummed. A barge moved slow as a sleeping beast. Across the water, the Dawn's tower glittered with men who believed they owned the gods. Back in the clearing, the sisters watched him approach with a wariness that had the edges of grief. Alessia's eyes were more human in dawn than night. You could read the old enforcer in them. Protective, clipped, a woman who knew how to calculate the worth of a life. Bianca's silence was a threat on two legs. She kept her distance like someone carrying a blade under her coat and policy in her spine. When Marco sat on the fallen trunk and placed the photograph between them, they sniffed at the paper like it might bleed. "Luciani knows," he told them. "Conte, he saw you. He's told them. He wants to buy you." The reaction was small and seismic. Alessia's lip curled in a snarl that was almost human fury, and for a moment she looked like the enforcer she had been before the curse. Bianca licked the photograph, a tiny, furious human gesture, as if tasting the ink could destroy the idea of the Dawn. Their grief was a weather front, sudden gusts of memory that changed the air. They had been used before, traded belligerence for shelter, violence for loyalty. Marco's confession hung there, dangerous and unfinished. He had told them the truth because secrets had always made things heavier, and weight had a habit of snapping men. He had never been brave enough to name all his sins. There were assassinations he had read orders for, bribes he'd laundered, a man's death he had watched happen for the price of a favor. But standing between two women who could and would tear a man limb from limb felt different. Vulnerability was not theatrical here, it was necessary. Alessia lowered herself onto him with gravity that made his ribs protest. When she spoke, when she allowed a human voice to unspool from the maw of a thing half-beast, her words were thick with the memory of orders and the arithmetic of vengeance. "You fed us when men only ever bled us," she said. "That buys you time, Marco Vellini. Maybe nothing else, but it buys you a debt." Bianca's head rested against his shoulder. "We are not trophies to be traded," she murmured. Her voice was an animal hush. "If Luciani wants to own us, he will learn what owning us costs." The dilemma declared itself with a clarity that felt like a sentence. Hand them over and climb the ladder of the family, trading their lives for his comfort, or defy the Dawn and become a target on the map, painted as traitor. Either path cut bone. Either path was a choice between different deaths. That was the terrible arithmetic of this city. Marco thought of his mother's missing years and the way his family's ledger had written over their humanity with ink, and he thought, impossibly, of the small, improbable tenderness of the night. He had wanted to be seen. He was being seen all right, by a Dawn who could make and unmake neighborhoods, and by two monstrous sisters who could, if they chose, remake an entire underworld. The river slid on, indifferent. Above them, the city prepared to make a decision without knowing it had to. Marco's knuckles whitened around the photograph. He had lived a life of small impositions. Move this package, meet this man, make this problem disappear. Now the problem was named. Luciani would want them, and wherever Luciani walked, men followed. He had the shortest, ugliest choice ahead. He had to tell someone. He had to decide which debts he would repay with flesh and which he would protect at the cost of the life he had been taught was expendable. The clearing held its own breath. The sisters watched him with patience that was the kind of weapon Marco recognized. He had always been an expert at reading other people's armor. He had never been enough of an armor for himself. For the first time, the calculus felt like more than survival. It felt like the naked possibility of loyalty that was not ledgered, of being protected for a small, ridiculous reason, because he had fed them once. That possibility made his chest ache. When he stood to go, the three of them moved like a single, strange family under a sky that could not tell them what was right. The dilemma followed him home like a stain. He had an appointment with his boss in the afternoon, a man who measured men by how quickly they completed tasks. Before that meeting could decide his fate, Don Luciani's emissary would find a way to make an offer. The city's old contracts were closing in again, and Marco, who knew the faces of capos and cops better than he knew his own, was about to be asked whether he would betray a debt of the heart for a ledger of power. Marco slept badly and found himself waking to the same tiny, private guilt that had trailed him since childhood, that he was built to repay with whatever he could spare. The warehouse smelled of oil and paper and the faint musk of the river, and the men who worked for him assumed the weight of him in the same way a tide assumes the curve of a bay, predictable, taken for granted. He dressed like someone who had been allowed to keep old debts, patched blazer, shirt with one button forever trying to escape. He moved through the morning as if through fog, each step measured, each nod to a capo like currency handed over. At midday, his lieutenant, Gino, cracked a smile that was all teeth and business. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Marco," he said, stacking envelopes with practiced indifference. "We got a meeting. Big boys want to see if you're still useful." He wanted to tell Gino everything, how two wolves licked his palm, how one of them had smelled of smoke and grief, how he'd felt something almost human twist in his chest. Instead, he learned to speak in the economy of the family, spare facts traded for safety. "Just a run," he said. "Paperwork. Don't get the boss in the mood for speeches." Gino's eyes were small and practical. "You keep the papers straight, you sleep like a man who's still got a place at the table." He didn't ask the question they all wanted to ask. He didn't have to. In that silence, the family assumed the worst and the best at once, that you were either quick enough to be useful or slow enough to be a liability. Marco lived in that margin. The meeting with the boss was a ceremony of power dressed in the day's dull grays. Capos in cheap suits, men who carried the city in the sleekness of their shoes and the coldness of their hands. Marco sat at the edge of the room like a boy too young to have earned a seat, and Don Vellini, older, less gilded than Luciani, but with a temper to match, spoke in the currency of measures. "We got wind," Don Vellini said, then drew the words out like a slow exhale. "Luciani's been sniffing. He wants to consolidate. He wants the Lycans. We hear a kid of ours is involved. Marco?" The room pivoted, all eyes like knives. Marco's mouth was dry. He could have lied. He knew how to make a lie smooth, tailor the edges until it fit the suit they wore. But the truth had already started its walk through the city. Lying would be a lazy surgery. "I fed them," he said. "2 sisters. I didn't know who they were at first. I only had a sandwich." An audible sound moved through the room, half laughter, half a curse. Vellini's face tightened into geometry. "You fed legends with your own hands," he said. "Do you understand that, boy? Luciani will pay any price to own them. He'll pay in men, in favor, he'll pay in blood. You understand the economics?" "Yes," Marco said. The word tasted like surrender. For a moment, the room was a cage. Men looked at him as if calculating how much of him to keep. He could see in their faces that they wanted to believe he had made a choice, but preferred the version where he had been useful, because the family could use that usefulness. Then Vellini said something softer, but like a blade pulled across skin. If Luciani gets them, he will not stop with Lycans. He wants our East End, our docks. He will make a market of fear. If he doesn't, we'll be the ones to take them. Either way, this is how wars begin. You either give them up to negotiate, or you help us take them. Marco felt the room tilt. Help them take them? Language that made no sense until it did. Help the family seize what he had fed. He pictured the sister's eyes, the way Alessia had rested her head in his lap as if pledging herself to a kindness she had known how to name. The idea of men entering that clearing with guns made the air in his chest tighten so severely he had trouble breathing. Vellini watched him like a ledger weighing columns. "You're on the mark, Marco. We'll need someone who knows the alleys. We'll need someone who is not sentimental." The last 3 words were a malediction. When he walked out of the meeting, Marco had the sensation of being ground down. He had to protect them, and the family wanted to own them. There was a third party, a detective with a ledger, a don across the river who wanted to buy legends. But for a moment, the question was narrower and knottier. Could he keep the sisters safe from the men whose hands he had once given down his debts to? He returned to the clearing at night under the pretense of checking traps. The sisters watched him, alert, their ribs a map of old wounds. They bore the city on their skin, bullet tips, knife scars, the pale stripes of chemical burns where someone had tried to weaponize what they were. They did not smile. They could not. Their faces were the bones behind the city's gossip, histories of pain that had learned to grow teeth. "You have a choice," Marco said into the dim. "My family, they want to use you. Luciani wants to buy you. Conte will trade your names for a promotion. I don't have weapons they want. All I have is this." He reached into his pocket and drew out a crumpled photograph instead of the ledger he'd been expected to bring. In it, a boy and his mother sat on a stoop, a time when debt met bread rather than blood. Words failed. The old ledger of favors and favors owed was a tangle too knotted to unknot in speech. Alessia studied him the way a woman reads a contract. Don't make promises you don't own. The family will not consider your heart. They will consider the value you offer or the cost of removing you. Bianca's voice was close enough that he felt its shadow on his cheek. "What do you want, Marco Vellini?" she asked. The question was a blade because he had never been asked in such plain terms. People had always wanted his action and never his choice. The truth asserted itself without permission. He wanted safety that did not come with chains. He wanted to atone without selling another life. He wanted, improbably, to be held in a ledger not of debts but of devotion. "I want you safe," he said simply. "I want a way to keep you where Luciani can't buy you and where the family can't weaponize you." They listened like 2 judges. Then Bianca's lips moved in a curve that was almost a human smile. "We will not hide forever," she said. "We need a plan. We need allies." Allies. The word was a small combustion. Allies in a city that preferred loyalties written in ink and paid in bones were rare. Marco thought of the detective who had his own ledger, of small players who wanted to climb, and of the families that had found in the sisters' absence a comfort they no longer had to fear. He thought of the low-level enforcers who owed him favors for lost ledgers, and the street vendors who would listen for coin. Creating allies meant bargaining in the currency he'd been taught to use: favors, silence, chits on a ledger. But to bargain so openly would alert Luciani, and then they would not be able to bargain at all. The first obstacle arrived like a man in a suit bringing an invoice. A car with blacked windows idled at the edge of the clearing one dusk, its engine soft as a cat. 3 men emerged, the kind whose suits were pressed to the exactness of men who ordered decisions, carrying an air like a threat with cufflinks. They did not move like hunters, they moved like men who had already decided the hunt's profit. Behind them walked a thin figure Marco recognized because his gossip listening made his ears a map. Rafael Conte, dressed in the victim's costume of a concerned officer. "Evening, Marco," Conte said, as if they were neighbors disputing a hedge. "We're looking for 2 women, lost perhaps, hungry, a pity. The Dawn has a soft spot for legends." Marco's throat closed. He had hoped that secrecy could be an invisibility cloak, one that blissfully failed once he realized the city rarely allowed for mysteries. "Not here," Marco said. His voice tried to be small enough to be ignored. "You must be mistaken." Conte's smile spread. "We're not men who like being mistaken." He stepped closer and produced a photograph from his coat. It was grainy but unmistakable. The 2 sisters in the clearing, captured the night Marco fed them. There's a reward, Marco, for the person who brings them to the dawn, for the person who proves their loyalty. Consider what that could look like for you. Behind Conte, the suited men shifted, and Marco could feel the pressure in his ribs, the same measure of fear that came from small boys and men when offered the ladder of purchase. "You'd hand them over?" he asked, a question he asked himself more than the detective. "It's business," Conte said, "and business does not do charity." He tossed the photograph into the dirt at Marco's feet as if it were a coin. The 2 wolves came at the sound, emerging from the tree line like sentinels called to an alarm. Alessia's fur bristled in a way that spoke of old orders and indignation. Bianca stepped forward and fixed Conte with the stare that had once made negotiators sign with trembling hands. "You brought the world to our doorstep," Bianca said. Her voice was low, a blade that sang in the air. Conte's jaw tightened. His hands did not move for his gun, but the men in suits made their own calculus. The standoff was small and tense, but the consequence felt vast. If Conte left and returned with men, if Luciani chose to purchase them rather than negotiate, the clearing would be a battlefield and Marco its architect by his silence. He could feel the city tilting toward a ruin that would be harder to rebuild than any ledger he had balanced. He wanted, in a single desperate human ache, to step between Conte and the sisters and do what men who loved did best, shield with their bodies. Instead, he did what he had always done. He bargained with the smallest thing he had to give. "Tell him," he said to Conte, "that they aren't trophies. They are leverage. He can't own them by force without the city burning brighter than his investments. If he wants them alive, he has to ask properly. He has to make a bargain." Conte's laugh was a small animal. "And you'll broker that for us? You'll broker peace with Lycans?" His smile folded into a threat. "You're either very brave or very desperate, Marco Vellini." Both were true. Marco felt something inside him harden. He had been useful to men who wanted his hands. Perhaps now his usefulness would be different. He would not hand them over. He would not let the city turn the sisters into a product. But the obstacle remained. How to protect them from men who turned debts into bullets, from a Don willing to buy a myth for all the wrong reasons, from a detective with a ledger of favors big enough to weigh a man down. Conte left that night, but not empty-handed. He took with him knowledge and a photograph, small things that would burgeon into strategic moves. The suited men stayed a little longer, eyes like bolts. The sisters watched Marco with something like assessment. He could feel the first cracks form in the world as pieces shifted. Luciani would make his move. The Vellini family would not allow passive losses. And Marco, who had once thrived as a fix for other men's messes, found himself in the center of a problem that had no neat solution. Conte left that night, but not empty-handed. He took with him knowledge and a photograph, small things that would burgeon into strategic moves. The suited men stayed a little longer, eyes like bolts. The sisters watched Marco with something like assessment. He could feel the first cracks form in the world as pieces shifted. Luciani would make his move. The Vellini family would not allow passive losses. And Marco, who had once thrived as a fix for other men's messes, found himself in the center of a problem that had no neat solution. When he walked back home, the city's lamps threw long, accusing shadows. He replayed the conversation with Conti, his lie in the Vellini meeting, the sisters' gravel voice verdict. He had been small for most of his life, but in the space where his humanity touched theirs, he had become something else, visible, valuable, and vulnerable. The press in question had not gone away. Who will he choose when the streets demand a name and a price? In the feel of his mouth, the answer tasted like rust and bread. He had promised nothing, but in the only place that mattered, the clearing, he had already given his heart away in crumbs. The consequences, like wolves, were circling. The first blow came not with bullets, but with a name. Gino found him in the break room, slouching over a chipped mug of coffee like any other morning man who'd lost the taste for bitter things. He walked in laughing as if nothing in the world had been rearranged, and then closed the door behind him like a trap. The smile on his face was fastened on, the way a man pins a flower to his lapel to hide a bruise. "They came by," he said, dropping a packet on the table with the care of a man handling a live thing. "The Don likes bargains, Marco. He likes people who make him richer." Marco felt the laugh peel off Gino's face as if it were a prop. Inside the packet were photos. The clearing at dusk, the sisters curled like monuments. And beneath them a slip of handwriting. It was simple, efficient. The address where the sisters slept most nights. The time when the patrols were light. It had a neat stamped header. Vellini Protection. Marco's fingers went numb holding the paper. "Who gave you this?" he asked. Gino's eyes were damped with something like pity. You feed two creatures and suddenly they're city property. The Don likes the idea of owning legend. He also likes the idea of rewarding the man who brings legend into his ledger. He didn't say it as an accusation. He said it as a plan. You bring them in, you get your mother's quarter paid back. You get a place at the table, you get safety. You'd turn them in, Marco said. The question fell from him the way a bell tolls, loudly, inevitably. Gino shrugged. We all turn things over eventually, Marco. We sell what is convenient. I'm being practical. He pushed the packet across the table. Think about it. We're not saviors. Marco's practical bones wanted to hook into that same survival calculus. But the sisters' faces, wet with the memory of the night he fed them, were on the photographs like a demand that would not let him sleep. He could hear Alessia's quiet arithmetic, the old enforcer's ledger that added lives and subtracted debts, and Bianca's more elemental tally, who had fed them and who had tried to own them. He had always known the price of favor in his world. Tonight, the price was 2 lives. He had, earlier that day, made mistakes that would widen the fracture. A foolish impulse, an idea that if he could gain the Don's trust, he might protect the sisters by influencing his terms, led him to meet Conte in the dim hallway behind a cafe. The detective had come to him with an offer that smelled of wiretaps and old grudges. I can keep them off the market for now, Conte had said, all charm and knife, if you give me something in return. What do you want? Marco asked, already afraid he knew. Conte leaned in. Names. The boys you work with. Evidence. Bosses who make you useful. He tapped the cigarette in his fingers like someone playing with a metronome. You give me something useful, and I give you time. Time is currency in this city. Time. Marco imagined the sisters sleeping under the moon, unbothered for another dusk. He wanted to barter for their nights, and in that want, he sold a piece of himself. He gave Conte 2 names, small men who ran drugs along a stretch of the river, and a list of ledgers that proved their movements. It bought him 3 nights of peace, a price Conte called a tidy compromise. But compromises in their world had a habit of eating the edges of things until nothing remained but rawness. Conte, shrewd as a butcher, did not simply take the names and disappear. He kept one ledger for himself, a photograph of a page in which Marco's handwriting had once signed a delivery order. It was older than the sisters' moon. That memo signed Marco's assent to a night that had led to someone dying. Not just some anonymous body, Conte said to himself with a fold of cruel satisfaction, but a body with a name that meant something to the sisters. He pocketed that photograph like a talisman, knowing the sting it would make when dropped. The next blow landed with the weight of betrayal. Alessia found the ledger. It was Marco's own hand on the page, the ink smudged the way it always was when he wrote fast. And the name beneath his signature was a name the sisters had carried like a wound, Matteo Rizzo. The ledger was a thing of small letters and sharp consequences. Matteo had been more than a name. He had been a protector once, a human friend of the sisters' old life, someone who had bound himself to their code and later fallen into the city's hungry maw. Rumor had long whispered that his death had started the chain that ended in their curse. Marco had, without remembering that memory well, signed an order the night Matteo bled out. He had been a boy then, frightened and useful. He had not connected the ledger then to the sisters now until Conte, clever and petty, left the photograph where hands would find it. Alessia confronted him in the rain, dripping and dark like a city in mourning. The clearing had turned into a bruise of mud and fur, and Marco waited with a coward's clarity for the moment that would topple him. She held the page between her teeth like a relic, and then dropped it into his hands. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was low and dangerous. "Why did you sign his name?" Marco saw the space between them tear open, something private and small that he had kept locked. He began. He had rehearsed apologies, confessions, but the syllables tumbled out wrong. "It was before. I was told to. I didn't know." He had been young, a man taught never to ask why when orders were issued. He had been useful, the kind of small sacrificial instrument his family preferred. He had watched a man die on the orders of people he respected. He had not understood the person he was making himself into until the face of the woman who had fed him returned to him with hunger and a ledger. Alessia's silence was not forgiveness. It was a court mounting charges. "You signed his death," she said finally. The words were slow and exact as a blade. "You made a man vanish for men who write prophets on the bones of the poor. You fed us bread, and you fed our friend to their ledgers." Marco felt the floor tilt. "I didn't know it would be Matteo," he said, a thin defense against the tide. He was a name then. I was a boy. I thought—" "You thought like a man who wanted to be seen," Bianca cut in. She had stood back until now, and the hurt in her face made Marco feel smaller than he'd ever been. "You wanted to trade favor for safety. You wanted to stitch yourself into a family's ledger so you could be counted. You ate bread instead of asking which hand fed it." The fracture that began with Alessia's discovery widened when Conte, like a careful arsonist, set the rest of the town alight. He fed the photograph to Vellini's men and whispered to Luciani's emissaries that Marco's hand had been present at Matteo's death. He told them that the boy who fed the sisters had once signed an order that left them children. By evening, men on both sides watched Marco not as a man, but as a symbol. Proof that loyalty could be traded, that kindness could be a thin veneer over the appetites of the powerful. If there is a sound in the world sharper than betrayal, it is the silence that follows when you realize one person you trusted has kept a ledger that includes you in its margins. The sisters recoiled as if struck. Alessia's eyes, always the hardest thing about her, became stone. Bianca walked away from him without looking back, a line of distance that felt like a wound being measured. The clearing felt larger suddenly, the night air colder, as if the world itself took stock and found him wanting. He tried to explain to Alessia, begged even, which was a thing he had never done. He told her about the childhood debt, about the smallness that had made him accept orders without interrogating them. He told her about his mother's quarter and the way his family's ledger had been built on men like him who do the invisible labor of violence. He told her, desperately, that he had fed her because he had once been fed, because he remembered a hand that had given him bread when he thought himself invisible, because he had hoped that gratitude could be its own sort of armor. Alessia's hands were calloused. They knew the weight of truth. "Mercy," she said quietly, and the word was a verdict. "You offered mercy and bought yourself a place in a book that reads our names as currency. Mercy is not payment, Marco. Mercy is a risk." Their rupture was not just about the ledger. It became a fissure of identity. For the sisters, who had been reduced from human to monster and then weapon, the discovery that a human had once put their enemy's name to paper invited the old narrative to return. Men who swapped lives for profit. For Marco, their recoil found his worst fear. He had wanted to be seen, and instead had been measured and found insufficient. In the days that followed, alliances shifted like loose leaves. Gino, whose loyalty had always been brittle, pulled closer to Vellini, smoothing his own path with smooth words and cold bargains. Conte, sensing the fracture had broken the delicate web of secrecy, began selling the story to tabloids and rumor mills, his grin like a coin rinsed clean. Men who had looked at Marco as a convenient tool now saw him as a liability. He lost the small courtesies of the warehouse, a nod, a cigarette handed over, a ledger passed without scrutiny. The city's whisper grew into rumor, and rumor into a dogged legalese of interested parties. The sisters kept their own counsel. Bianca retreated from him into a quiet that felt like mourning. She moved among the alleys on the nights, a silhouette that avoided the trade of men's eyes. Alessia orbited closer, not trusting but not abandoning. When she did speak to Marco, it was in clipped sentences that cut the air. "You will have to make a thing right," she told him once, "by action, not words." He agreed, because what else could he do? His promises had been currency he no longer had the credit to spend. He began to move in the only language the city responded to, deeds. He found the men Conte had named and withdrew the evidence he had given, like someone trying to unwrite a will. He traced favor to favor, offering what little currency he had to barter for silence and for protection. He went to old clients and borrowed, against futures, against the small debts people owed him, until his own ledger was a tangle of IOUs. He knew now that penance in their world demanded more than confession. It required sacrifice. Yet the hardest fracture was not between him and the city. It was between the idea of himself and what the sisters now thought he could be. There is a unique, intimate violence in being loved by someone and then discovered to have written the instrument of their grief. The sisters' eyes measured him not by the sandwich he had brought, but by the signatures he had made. His acts of tenderness had been re-evaluated through the prism of complicity. Even his confession, the raw, trembling blurt of it, felt inadequate. The carrying weight of all of it bent him into new shapes. He began to sleep in the warehouse less, preferring alley corners and cramped back rooms where the city's hum could be mistaken for a lullaby. He learned to move unseen, to make a list of those who could be trusted and treat them like a map. He found, tucked in the margins of his old business, one small friend, an old street vendor named Rosa who had once seen his mother. She listened without judgment and gave him a key, not to men in suits, but to people in corners, to whispers that could become shields if held together with enough love. But protection costs. The Vellini family, with its particular appetite for consolidation, did not appreciate Marco's hesitation. The idea that a Vellini man might balk at participating in their fight was an insult to the ledger. Don Vellini, pragmatic and cruel, issued a different kind of order, one that would test the fragile threads left between Marco and the sisters. He told Gino to prepare a small team to secure the clearing, to make sure that if Luciani's men tried to buy or capture them, Vellini's had the first claim. It was not an order shouted in anger. It was bureaucracy with teeth. Gino, who had already placed himself in the middling warmth of the Don's favor, executed the order with a businessman's grace. He told Marco it was for control, a word that tasted like a bribe of the worst sort. Marco, who had by then learned to count the cost of action, tried to disobey. He argued, pleaded, even threatened with the kind of bluster that no one believes. Gino stood in the warehouse doorway, the air between them full of ledger lines and broken promises, and said simply, "You are late on your debts, Marco. We all are." That night, as the city darkened and the river shivered under the moon, men moved toward the clearing with the quick, quiet efficiency of those who have rehearsed violence. Marco reached the outskirts and saw flashlights bobbing like the eyes of a predatory constellation. Alessia and Bianca were there, their fur outlined against the low sky, their bodies tense as coiled springs. For a moment, as men in suits emerged, Marco reached for the thing none of them had: honesty. "I won't let them take you," he said to the sisters, and for the first time the words came out flat and true. But honesty is fragile where bullets are pragmatic. Men called Vellini's name like scripture, and Luciani's emissary answered with a rattling of promises and names. Guns glinted. Men he thought friends shifted like bad weather. The clearing became a market, and Marco, who had wanted nothing more than to be seen, stood in its middle, exposed. The fracture opened then, raw and inevitable. Gino's men advanced with ropes and nets, the kind designed for beasts that were also stories. Conte watched from the periphery, his face the silver smile of a surgeon with his knife. The sisters lunged, Alessia roaring like a cannon fired in the wrong direction, Bianca moving with terrifying, precise geometry. Yet their fury was not the only force. Behind it came a cascade of men with badges, men whose ledgers had been bought for favors, and the clearing that had once belonged to moonlight and memory turned into a scene of pragmatic violence. Marco understood in that moment the shape of his failure. He had tried to balance a ledger with crumbs. He had tried to trade secrecy for salvation. The result held the geometry of broken things. Alessia's cry cut loose like a bell. Bianca's silhouette blurred in motion, and the men moved in to close the space between beast and capture. He tried, last and fierce, to do what he had not done before, to run between the men and the women he loved. He shoved a suit aside with nonsense courage and found himself slammed by a boot, his head hitting the dirt with the clarity of a bell. He heard a shout, a gunfire crack. No aim, just a message sent, and then felt hands on him, lifting him like an apology. The men in suits dragged him toward their truck, their grip both a statement and a bargain. Gino's face passed above him, apologies and profit balanced in the set of his mouth. Alicia's voice, raw, human, sudden, broke him open as she struggled with the men who wanted to bind her. "Marco!" she yelled, and the name was both a demand and a disaster. In that single syllable he heard all of it, the nights of feeding, the ledger of signatures, the breaking of trust. He wanted to tell her everything, names, debts, the smallness that had shaped his decisions, but the words tangled and fell silent. As the men dragged him away, Conte watched him like a man watching an experiment prove itself. The sisters, their bodies streaked with mud and old grief, were hauled toward trucks that smelled of iron and policy. Marco's last sight before hands covered his mouth and the world narrowed to the press of a collar was Bianca's face, a blade of betrayal, a river of sorrow, and Alicia's eyes, older than the moon. When the truck door slammed, the city hummed on as if deaf to its own small cruelties. Marco sat inside, his hands tied, his mouth tasting of rust and bread, and felt the rawness inside him harden into something like resolve. The fracture had widened into an abyss, but inside that darkness, a new question lit like a match. How did one mend what had been broken when the city's law was built on ledgers and the hearts of two women had been written as collateral? He had been useful his whole life to men who measured value in convenience. Now the measure that mattered was not the profit he could deliver, but the cost he would be willing to pay to stitch back a different kind of ledger, one where a debt could be repaid not with blood, but with the only currency he had left, his capacity to risk, to confess, to sacrifice. The next steps would have to be taken in a city that no longer trusted him, with two women whose mouths had called his name as both plea and indictment. The fracture had been made. The pieces had shifted. Now, in that truck that smelled of men's cologne and wet metal, Marco Vellini realized that to reclaim what he'd broken, he would have to break the city open and let its light into places that had always been kept dark. The truck smelled of wet metal and other people's civility, a perfume of shirts pressed for courtrooms and men who believed paperwork could hold a life. Marco's hands were bound with the rough efficiency of men who always found a way to do the necessary thing. His head throbbed, and beneath the pulse, the memory of Alicia's palm in his lap kept replaying like a tender wound. He should have felt the panic that comes with ropes and closed doors. Instead, a different hunger gnawed, the need to take responsibility with hands that had only ever hidden behind ledgers. Outside, the night had moved like a conspirator. Footsteps, muffled curses, the quick rustle of netting. Then, beyond the edge of the clearing, an orchestra of sound rose. Not men's voices, but wolves. Hundreds, a tide of breath and fur unrolling through alleys and over rooftops. Marco's breath hitched. The world had sharpened into a single instant of impossible possibility. Alicia's roar had been the iron bell. Bianca's calculated fury, the blade. Their bodies, when caught and hauled, had not contained the story. They had summoned it. The first truck driver cursed at the sudden weight of bodies pressing in the dark, as wolves pressed like a living wall at the edge of men's light. Tires squealed, radios hissed. Conte barked orders that sounded small and fracturing against the night's rising chorus. Hold! A hand snapped at Marco's collar, but the command came thin and fragile. On the other side of the metal, Marco could hear men scrambling. He saw a flash of movement. Alicia breaking free, teeth like iron against rope. Bianca moving with the strange geometry of someone who had once walked in human suits and now stitched herself into the attack. They were not aiming for slaughter. They were aiming for fracture, for the exact moment when the city's neat equations failed. Marco reached up and mouthed a single thing at the sister who had once tucked her head in his lap. He could not shout over the pack. He could not promise what he had not yet earned. He did the only thing left. He offered himself, not in words, but in the language the world would understand. "Leave them," he shouted, voice cracking like old glass. Take me instead." It was a stupid, human bargain, and also the truest thing he could give. Alessia's glance found him, amber, fatal, something that read him down to the ledger inside his chest. For a breath, the night held them in a private calculus. A man who had signed a page that ruined them. A man who gave them bread. A man who held guilt large enough to trade his own bones. Bianca moved first. She struck Conte's arm with the speed of a hand that had once closed a deal and now closed a lifeline. Men stumbled. Boots slid in the churned mud. The wolves, 700 strong in rumor and now in thunder, fell upon the clearing with purpose, not to slaughter indiscriminately, but to dismantle the architecture of men who treat people as inventory. They sank between trucks and men like a tide, tearing radio wires, scattering flashlights, pushing the wedge through which mercy might slip. Marco's captors, faced with a wall of fur and sound, reacted like men who had been taught to choose the ledger of self-preservation. One shoved him forward, meant to use him like a shield. The move gave Alessia the sliver of time she needed. She hurled herself through the torn mesh of the truck, claws catching canvas and leather, jaws finding rope. Her teeth were not for killing him. They were for severing the binding that made him captive. Bianca followed, a blade of intent, and together they tore at the restraints as if ripping away paper from a contract that had never honored its signatures. When the ropes fell away, Marco inhaled as if the night had returned his own lungs. He should have run. He should have melted into the dark and become a rumor again. Instead, he stayed, because running would mean leaving them to men who count people as profit. He moved between the sisters and the men in suits like a man stepping into the path of artillery, hands empty, heart full of the kind of bravery you only get from the fear of losing what you love. Alessia found him, and for a second there was no beast in her face, only the roughness of a woman who had been hurt long enough to learn the architecture of forgiveness. She bared her teeth to a man who had once been counted as a thing, and set them free from the ledger's hold. "You pay this with me," she said, voice hoarse with meaning. "You do not trade us for your safety." Marco staggered, lungs burning, and then he understood the real bargain he had always wanted. Not protection bought by betrayal, but protection earned by sacrifice. He stepped forward into the line between man and wolf, into the space where bullets had always decided things. He turned his face up to Luciani's men, eyes steady in a way he hadn't thought he owned. "Take me," he said again, and this time there was something like command under the plea. "Take me and keep them. You want to own legend? Own me. I'll sign whatever pages you need. I'll take whatever sentence you damn me to. But you will not take them." It was madness in the ledger's currency, but madness had always been a form of currency the sisters understood. In the pause that followed, a man in a pressed suit raised his gun and stopped because the city is full of men who can be made to hesitate when someone gives love as a price. For reasons that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with watching another man choose to be small so others could live, the shooter's finger slackened. Then gunfire cracked, wild, angry, and the clearing became a storm. Marco felt the bullet like a hand taking him, felt the hot bloom of betrayal open its map across his chest. He stumbled and fell to his knees as Alessia threw herself to his side, her large head pressed against his wound, fur damp with blood. Bianca crouched at his back, a brace and a promise. He tasted iron and bread, and in the small miracle of pain, he had the clarity of clean confession. "I'm sorry," he whimpered, a child's feral prayer. "For Matteo, for everything." Alessia's fingers, calloused and precise, curled into his collar like a benediction. "We know the difference between the man who signs and the man who repents," she said. Her voice, when it came, was the rough music of someone who had been taught by cruelty how to be kind. "You paid with yourself and not with us. That changes the account." Bianca leaned in, her face softening in a way Marco had never seen human skin do for him. She pressed a wet nose to his brow, a seal on a pact he had not fully believed he deserved. "You gave us bread when we needed it," she said. "Tonight you gave us your body." He wanted to tell them everything, how his mother taught him to read faces, how his ledger had been filled in pieces, but words dragged like stones. Instead, he let the sisters hold him as the wolves reorganized the night into their own terms. Men fled into the dark with the furtive speed of those who had learned to fear a tide that could not be contained. Radios squawked and died. The dawn's emissary cursed in a language of lost control. As the first gray of dawn washed the city into a reluctant truth, those who remained in the clearing, Marco, bruised and bleeding, Alessia and Bianca, ragged and triumphant, sat within the wreckage like a small, desperate family. The wolves lingered, circling with a patient guardianship that felt like law. Marco's wound throbbed, and the world narrowed to the feel of their breath, the smear of warmth against his skin. He had traded himself for their safety, and in that exchange, something old and thorny inside him cleared. The city could still write ledgers and buy legends, but for a moment the pages were held aside. He had become the sort of man the sisters had never thought to invest in, someone who would risk his bones, not for profit, but for a fragile human mercy. Alessia rested her head near his hand, and Bianca's fingers closed over his palm like a contract that would not be turned into a weapon. Marco, in the broken hush between night and dawn, understood that redemption was not a one-time clearing of debt, but an ongoing ledger kept by actions, by risks taken in the raw dark where men and monsters learn to keep one another. He had been small for most of his life. In the clearing, with wolves howling softly around them, he had become something else, claiming not the power of the city's contracts, but the tender authority of a promise kept. When the sirens finally began to stir at the edge of the woods, late, cursing their own tardiness, the sisters rose like statues and moved with the composure of two old rulers who had reclaimed their crown. They did not ask him to run. They did not demand he hide. They only pressed a fleeting, fierce human thing to his lips, a kiss that tasted like apology and forgiveness, savage and profound. He felt the world tilt, and in that tilt a new possibility opened, that love, when paid an honest risk, could unwrite even long-established ledgers. He had fed two giant Lycan sisters, and in the price of his body had bought something far more dangerous than life. He had bought a chance at belonging. They moved through the city like an aftershock, small ripples at first, then a reshaping. Newsrooms devoured the footage Conte couldn't keep hidden. A fixer who traded himself for two women the world called monsters. Don Luciani muttered about losses and markets undone. His emissaries retreated like men who had misjudged tide. Vellini's machine coughed and recalibrated. Some men were reprimanded, others quietly reassigned to jobs that required fewer consciences. The ledger of the underworld, for the first time in a long while, showed an unbalanced entry. Love as a cost. Marco woken slow in a room that smelled of antiseptic and the faint musk of wolf hair. The wound at his ribs burned, but the pain gave the lie to nothing. It was proof. Alessia sat nearby, awake and watchful, her hand finding his with the easy permanence of someone who keeps a promise like a weapon. Bianca dozed against the foot of the cot, quiet and feral, a sentinel who'd learned how to shelter without chains. They did not leave the city. Legends could flee into the hills and other stories might sprout in their absence. Instead, they remapped the city from within. The sisters reclaimed corners that had become battle-scarred, not to rule with old brutality, but to enforce a harsher code. No buying, no selling of names, no turning of lives into inventories. Men caught trafficking human worth into profit found in alleyways and under moonlight a pack whose judgment was immediate and unrelenting. The change was not legal. Courts and collars still favored men with cufflinks, but it was palpable. Vendors who once paid protection now paid no one. Neighborhoods began to breathe. Marco learned the grammar of this new life in small things. He took to walking the river at dawn, stitches aching, wallet lighter, but conscience cleaner. He rebuilt his ledger, not with IOUs for favors, but with inventories of kindness. Rose's unpaid rent covered, a schoolboy's books replaced, a cook's stove fixed. He brokered nothing for glory. His currency was work. The family he'd been born into watched him with a mixture of fury and bewilderment, but within the clearing he'd made, a different family of two enormous women, a convocation of wolves, and a handful of people who believed in a different kind of loyalty. Occasionally, men still came with offers. Luciani's underlings once promising sanctuary for a price, Vellini's operatives asking for old ways. The answers were simple now. No. Alessia's voice, when she spoke in the warehouse they repaired into a community kitchen, was gravel and verdict. Bianca's hands built shelves where once they had smashed heads. Both taught Marco how to translate mercy into policy, small acts that rippled outward into safety. He taught them how to read police rotations and how to paper over the city's blind spots. Together, they were the oddest governing council the river had ever seen. At night, when the pack slowed to a living tide around the clearing, Marco would walk to the water's edge and burn the last of his old ledgers. Ink curled into smoke and was carried across the river where towers of men still counted profits. He watched the pages blacken and drift away, not because the past could be erased, but because the act of unmaking felt like a necessary ritual. One evening, with moonlight polishing the water and the pack lying folded like a promise, Alessia climbed beside him on the riverbank. Bianca padded soundlessly to his other side. The three of them sat in a hush that felt like a heartbeat. Wolves lifted their heads and let out a low, communal breath that sounded, in Marco's ears, like benediction. "Is this our new ledger?" he asked quietly. Alessia's amber gaze found his, softer than it had any right to be. "We write it ourselves," she said. "Not in columns of profit, but in nights kept, mouths fed, children's laughter protected." Bianca nudged his hand with a wet nose, and the moon caught the smear of fur on his skin like a seal. Marco rested his palm on the grass, fingers stained with ash and ink and the grit of work. Around them, 700 wolves settled deeper, a living border between the city's hungry calculus and the small, stubborn place they had carved out. A place where a sandwich had once begun a chain of consequences, and a man had paid for kindness with more than money. Under the moon's indifferent watch, Marco smiled, a small, honest thing. The city would keep spinning its ledgers, but here, by the river with wolves and two giant sisters and a scar that would never completely fade, he'd found a new way to be counted. The pack's breath rose in the cold air like a chorus. It sounded to him like forgiveness, and like a promise no man could buy.